The morning of December 7th, 1941, dawned clear and bright over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Pacific waters stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their surface shimmering like liquid silver under the early sun. On Ford Island, sailors moved through their Sunday routines with the casual ease of men who believed themselves safe, protected by thousands of miles of ocean from the wars consuming Europe and Asia. In the enlisted men's barracks at Hickam Field, 22-year-old James "Jimmy" Harrison from a small farming town in Kansas slept soundly, dreaming of home and the wheat fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Jimmy had enlisted 8 months earlier, driven by a sense of duty he couldn't quite articulate to his mother when she'd cried on the front porch of their farmhouse. "Someone's got to stand up for what's right, Ma," he'd told her, his calloused hands that had known nothing but honest farm work, holding hers gently. Now those same hands would be tested in ways he never imagined. At 7:48 a.m., the tranquil morning shattered into chaos as the first wave of Japanese aircraft screamed overhead, their engines drowning out the Sunday church bells that had just begun to ring across the island. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're from. Your support means everything to us as we share these important stories of courage and sacrifice. Jimmy woke to explosions that shook the very foundations of the barracks. For a moment, suspended in confusion, he thought it was a training exercise gone wrong. Then he heard the screams, saw through the window the black smoke rising from Battleship Row, watched in horror as the USS Arizona erupted in a fireball that seemed to tear the sky itself apart. Men around him scrambled for uniforms, for weapons, for understanding. Some stood frozen, their minds unable to process what their eyes witnessed. But Jimmy Harrison, farm boy from Kansas, who'd never seen combat, never fired a weapon in anger, felt something crystallize inside him, a clarity of purpose that would define the rest of his life. "Move! Everyone move!" The voice belonged to Sergeant William Chen, a first-generation American whose parents had immigrated from China, who'd faced prejudice and doubt but had proven himself through sheer determination and an unwavering belief in the American dream. Chen's face was cut, blood running down his cheek from flying glass, but his eyes blazed with fierce resolve. "This is not a drill. We're under attack. Get to your stations." Jimmy grabbed his boots, his fingers fumbling with the laces as another explosion rocked the building. Around him, men he'd shared meals with, laughed with, complained about military life with, were transforming before his eyes. Fear didn't disappear, it never does, but something stronger rose to meet it. They were soldiers now, not in title but in truth, and their country needed them. The chaos outside defied description. Aircraft strafed the airfield, their machine guns cutting down men who ran across open ground. Hangars burned with such intensity that the heat could be felt hundreds of yards away. The carefully ordered world of military precision had dissolved into a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and death. Yet amid this hell, Jimmy witnessed acts of heroism that would stay with him forever. He saw Corporal Davis, a quiet man from Tennessee who collected stamps and wrote poetry, run through withering fire to drag a wounded pilot from a burning plane. He watched as nurses from the base hospital, their white uniforms soon stained red, worked with hands steady as stone to save lives while bombs fell around them. Jimmy found himself at an anti-aircraft gun with 3 other men, Martinez from New Mexico, O'Brien from Boston, and Jackson from Alabama. None of them had extensive training on this particular weapon. They learned as they fought, loading shells with hands that shook but never stopped moving, tracking targets through smoke and tears, firing until the barrels glowed red-hot. When Martinez took shrapnel in his shoulder, he refused to leave his post, loading shells with one arm while blood soaked through his makeshift bandage. "You see that one?" O'Brien shouted, pointing at a Japanese bomber making its run toward the harbor. "That bastard's mine!" His shot went wide, but Jackson's found its mark. The plane veered, trailing smoke, and crashed into the water beyond the harbor entrance. There was no celebration, no time for acknowledgement. Another plane appeared, then another. The battle consumed everything: time, fear, individual identity. They became a single organism with one purpose: fight back. Sergeant Chen moved between gun positions, coordinating fire, encouraging men, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. When Private Wilson, barely 18 years old, froze at his station, paralyzed by terror, as a Zero fighter dove straight toward their position, Chen didn't yell or curse. He placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder and spoke words Jimmy would remember decades later. "Wilson, your mama didn't raise a coward, she raised an American. Now show these sons of bitches what that means." Wilson's hands found the gun's controls. His shots struck true, sending the Zero spinning into the ground. The young private vomited immediately after, his body shaking violently, but he stayed at his post. He'd found something inside himself he hadn't known existed. The same thing they were all discovering in this crucible of fire and death. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but it felt like an eternity, compressed into moments of searing intensity. When the last Japanese plane disappeared toward the horizon, leaving behind a scene of devastation that seemed impossible to comprehend, the men stood amid the smoke and ruin, covered in soot and blood, some their own, much of it belonging to friends who would never see another sunrise. The USS Arizona lay broken and burning, entombing over 1,000 sailors. The USS Oklahoma had capsized, her hull showing like the belly of a dying whale. Across the harbor, ships burned, buildings smoldered, and the air itself seemed poisoned with smoke and grief. Jimmy Harrison sat on the ground, his back against a sandbag wall, and finally allowed himself to cry. Not from fear, that had been burned away in the furnace of combat, but from the terrible weight of what he'd witnessed, what he'd survived, what his friends had not. Martinez sat beside him, his wounded shoulder now properly bandaged by a medic who'd worked with hands gentle despite the chaos. O'Brien stood nearby, staring at the harbor, his face a mask of stone. Jackson had his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "We're at war now," Chen said quietly, standing before them. His voice carried no triumph, only grim acceptance. "This morning we were peacetime soldiers. Now we're warriors, whether we wanted to be or not. What happened here today," he gestured at the destruction surrounding them, "will echo through history. But so will what we do next. So will how we respond to this day." In the hours that followed, as rescue operations began in earnest, and the full scope of the catastrophe became clear, something remarkable happened among the survivors. The shock and grief didn't paralyze them. It galvanized them. Men worked through exhaustion to rescue trapped sailors from capsized ships, cutting through steel with bare hands when tools weren't available. Nurses and doctors operated in makeshift facilities, performing miracles with limited supplies. Civilian workers from the harbor joined military personnel, no distinctions made between ranks or roles, only a shared determination to save every life possible. Jimmy found himself in a rescue crew, trying to reach sailors trapped in the overturned USS Oklahoma. They could hear the men inside, pounding on the hull in a desperate Morse code message: "SOS, SOS, help us." The sound of those impacts against steel, the knowledge that living men were dying by inches in the darkness while he stood in daylight, drove Jimmy to work with a frenzy that bordered on madness. For 16 hours straight, he and others cut and burned and pried, their hands bleeding, their bodies screaming for rest they refused to give. When they finally broke through, pulling out 32 sailors who'd been given up for dead, Jimmy collapsed. But before unconsciousness claimed him, he saw something in the eyes of those rescued men, a gratitude so profound it transcended words, a recognition of shared humanity tested in the absolute extreme. One of the sailors, a chief petty officer named Roberts, whose hair had gone white during his hours of entombment, gripped Jimmy's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "You didn't quit on us. You didn't quit." "We're Americans," Jimmy replied simply. "We don't quit." The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, yet they contained a truth that would be proven again and again in the years to come. In that moment, lying on the oil-stained ground of Pearl Harbor, Jimmy Harrison understood that December 7th, 1941, hadn't just been a military attack. It had been a crucible that revealed the essential character of a nation. They had been tested and found themselves capable of extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and determination. As night fell over Hawaii, bringing with it the fear of another attack, the exhausted defenders maintained their vigil. They manned their guns, tended to their wounded, counted their dead, and made a silent promise to the fallen. This attack had awakened a sleeping giant, and the response would be measured not in days or months, but in years of relentless determination. The road ahead would be long, bloody, and hard, but they would walk it together, ordinary men transformed into something greater by the crucible of war. Jimmy sat with his unit as darkness deepened, listening to the sounds of continuing rescue operations, watching the fires still burning across the harbor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horrors, new tests of courage. But tonight, they were alive. They had fought back. They had saved lives. And though the cost had been terrible, though the pain was overwhelming, they had discovered something precious and unbreakable within themselves, the strength to stand when everything demanded they fall, to fight when every instinct screamed to flee, to persevere when all seemed lost. This was just the beginning. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, America underwent a transformation unlike anything in its history. The attack had unified a nation previously divided over intervention in foreign wars. Now, from the factories of Detroit to the shipyards of San Francisco, from the farms of the Midwest to the offices of New York, Americans rallied to answer their country's call. Young men lined up by the thousands at recruitment offices, many lying about their age, desperate to serve. The question was no longer whether to fight, but how quickly they could be ready. Jimmy Harrison and his surviving unit members at Pearl Harbor became inadvertent heroes, their stories carried in newspapers across the nation. But Jimmy felt no pride in the designation. He'd seen too much death, pulled too many broken bodies from wreckage, heard too many final words from dying friends. When reporters tried to interview him at the hospital where he'd been taken for exhaustion and minor injuries, he turned them away. "Write about the men who didn't come back," he told one persistent journalist. "They're the real heroes." But the military had other plans for Jimmy and the Pearl Harbor survivors. They possessed something invaluable: combat experience. While America's industrial might could produce ships, planes, and weapons, it couldn't manufacture the hard-won knowledge of men who'd faced enemy fire and survived. Within days of the attack, Jimmy found himself transferred to Camp Pendleton in California, where raw recruits were being forged into Marines at a pace that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The training regimen was brutal by design. 5 weeks of intensive instruction compressed months of peacetime training into a crucible of physical and mental transformation. Jimmy watched as young men, some barely 18, others who'd forged their birth certificates to enlist at 16, arrived soft from civilian life and emerged hardened, capable, dangerous. The instructors, many of them veterans like Sergeant Chen, who'd also survived Pearl Harbor, drove the recruits mercilessly, not from cruelty, but from the terrible knowledge of what awaited these boys in the Pacific. "You think this is hard?" Chen would shout as recruits struggled through their 3rd hour of hand-to-hand combat training, their bodies screaming for rest. Japanese won't give you a break. They won't feel sorry for you. They'll kill you without hesitation, and if you're not ready, if you're not harder than they are, you'll die on some godforsaken island, and your mother will get a telegram." His words were harsh, but his eyes held a different message, one that the recruits slowly began to understand. Every moment of suffering in training was a moment that might save their lives in combat. Jimmy's role was to share his experiences, to make the threat real for these young men who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. He spoke to groups of recruits in the evenings, describing not the glorious aspects of battle, but the terrifying, chaotic reality of it. He told them about the smell of burning oil and flesh, about the sound of men screaming for their mothers, about the way time seemed to both accelerate and freeze during combat. He showed them his hands, still scarred from cutting through steel to rescue trapped sailors, and explained that the real test wasn't whether you felt fear, everyone did, but whether you could function despite it. "I was a farm kid from Kansas," Jimmy told one group of wide-eyed recruits. "I'd never been in a fight, never shot at anything more dangerous than a coyote threatening our chickens. 6 months ago, I was worrying about crop yields and whether Sally Henderson would go to the church social with me. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and I learned something about myself, about all of us. We're capable of more than we know. When everything goes to hell and you think you can't take another step, can't lift another wounded man, can't fire one more round, you find something inside yourself. You find it because your brothers need you to find it, because your country needs you to find it, because the alternative is unacceptable." Among the recruits hanging on Jimmy's every word was a young man named Tommy Chen, Sergeant William Chen's younger brother. Tommy had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, lying about a heart murmur that should have disqualified him from service. He was smaller than most of the other recruits, and some questioned whether he'd make it through training. But Jimmy saw something familiar in Tommy's eyes, the same fierce determination his brother possessed, the same unwillingness to accept limits or defeat. Tommy struggled with the physical demands of training. During forced marches, he fell behind. During hand-to-hand combat exercises, larger men threw him around like a rag doll. But he never quit, never asked for special treatment, never complained. When other recruits rested, Tommy did extra exercises. When others slept, he practiced his marksmanship, his rifle drill, his map reading. Jimmy took notice and began working with Tommy privately, teaching him techniques he'd learned at Pearl Harbor, sharing hard-won wisdom about combat. "Size doesn't matter as much as people think," Jimmy told Tommy during one late-night training session. "I've seen big men freeze and small men fight like demons. What matters is up here." He tapped his temple. "And here," he placed his hand over his heart. "You've got heart, Chen. Your brother would be proud." "My brother saved lives at Pearl Harbor," Tommy replied, his voice quiet but intense. "I want to make him proud. I want to make our parents proud. They came to America with nothing, worked themselves nearly to death to give us opportunities. Now America needs us. How can I give anything less than everything?" It was a sentiment echoed across training camps throughout the nation. The recruits came from every background imaginable: farm boys and city kids, college students and factory workers, immigrant sons and descendants of Revolutionary War veterans. They were Irish and Italian, German and Polish, Mexican and Chinese, black and white, a true cross-section of American diversity. And while prejudice hadn't disappeared, black soldiers trained in segregated units, facing discrimination even as they prepared to fight for their country. The shared purpose of defeating a common enemy created bonds that transcended many old divisions. Jimmy witnessed these transformations daily. He watched Parker, a bookish kid from Philadelphia who'd never held a gun, become an expert marksman. He saw Rodriguez from Texas, who'd picked cotton since age 5, master tactics and strategy with a natural gift for spatial reasoning. He observed Washington, a black recruit from Alabama who faced casual racism from some fellow soldiers, yet proved himself the best combat swimmer in the entire company, earning grudging respect through undeniable competence. The training extended beyond physical preparation. The recruits learned about Japanese tactics, culture, and military capability. They studied maps of Pacific islands with unpronounceable names, memorized codes and signals, practiced amphibious landing procedures in the cold California surf. Every day brought new skills, new knowledge, new hardships designed to prepare them for the ultimate test. Sergeant Chen pushed them relentlessly, but he also protected them. When a visiting officer suggested that the training was too soft and recommended cutting meal rations to toughen them up, Chen stood his ground. "Sir, with respect, these men need fuel. We're working them 18 hours a day. Starve them, and you'll break them, not toughen them. I saw what our men could do at Pearl Harbor when they were properly trained and prepared. I know what we're sending these boys into. They need to be their absolute best, and that means proper nutrition, adequate rest, and intelligent training, not sadistic punishment." The officer, a career military man who'd never seen combat, bristled at Chen's tone. Jimmy stepped forward, his Pearl Harbor veteran status giving him authority that transcended rank. "The sergeant is right, sir. I've been in combat. These men will face horrors beyond imagination. They need to be strong, not weakened by arbitrary hardship. Save the suffering for when it matters, when they're facing the enemy." The officer backed down, and the training continued. The incident reinforced something Jimmy had learned at Pearl Harbor. True leadership meant protecting your men, speaking truth even when uncomfortable, and prioritizing mission success over ego or convention. These lessons would prove crucial in the months to come. As winter turned to spring in 1942, the scope of America's mobilization became staggering. Factories that had produced automobiles now manufactured tanks and aircraft. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles traditionally reserved for men, proving themselves equally capable in welding, riveting, assembly, and engineering. The entire nation had become a war machine, and its output was extraordinary. But weapons alone wouldn't win the war. Victory would require men willing to use those weapons, to face enemy fire, to hold positions against overwhelming odds, to sacrifice themselves if necessary for the greater good. It would require ordinary Americans to become extraordinary soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. The training camps were where this transformation occurred, where civilians became warriors, where boys became men. Jimmy received his orders in late March. He was being assigned to a newly formed Marine unit preparing for deployment to the Pacific Theater. The destination was classified, but everyone knew they were heading into combat. The question was where and when. Tommy Chen received the same orders. His determination and improvement during training had earned him a spot in a combat unit rather than being held back for additional instruction. The night before their deployment, the unit gathered for a final briefing. Sergeant Chen addressed them, his voice carrying the weight of experience and responsibility. "Tomorrow we ship out. Some of you won't come back. That's the brutal truth of war. But those who do return will have the satisfaction of knowing they stood up when their country needed them most. You'll have defended not just American soil, but American values, freedom, democracy, justice. The enemy attacked us because they thought we were soft, divided, weak. We're going to prove them catastrophically wrong." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of his men, young faces, some still bearing traces of teenage acne, others already marked by the intensity of their training. "You're not the same men who walked into this camp. You've been tested, trained, pushed to your limits and beyond. You've learned to function as a unit, to trust the man beside you with your life. That trust, that brotherhood, That's what will get you through what's coming. Not your rifle, not your grenades, not your physical strength. Your brothers. Fight for them, and they'll fight for you. Jimmy felt the truth of those words in his bones. He thought of the men he'd fought beside at Pearl Harbor, Martinez with his wounded shoulder refusing to leave his post, O'Brien tracking targets through tears and smoke, Jackson finding his courage when it mattered most. He thought of Davis running through fire to save a pilot, of young Wilson overcoming paralyzing fear to shoot down a Zero. Those men had become his brothers in the crucible of combat, and these new recruits would become brothers to each other in the battles ahead. The briefing ended, but no one moved to leave. They sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts, contemplating what lay ahead. Finally, someone began singing, softly at first, then with growing confidence. It was "God Bless America," and one by one the others joined in. The song filled the barracks, carried out into the California night, a defiant assertion of identity and purpose. They were Americans, and they were ready to prove what that meant. Jimmy closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. He thought of his mother back in Kansas, probably at that very moment praying for his safety. He thought of Sally Henderson, who'd written him faithfully since his deployment, her letters filled with news from home and quiet declarations of affection. He thought of the wheat fields he'd known all his life, golden under the summer sun, endless and beautiful and worth defending. He thought of the men who'd died at Pearl Harbor, who'd never see another sunrise, never hold their loved ones again, never fulfill their dreams and potential. "We'll make it mean something," he whispered to the memory of those fallen men. "Your deaths won't be in vain. We'll fight until this war is won, until America is safe, until the world is free again. I swear it." Around him, his brothers in arms made the same silent vow. Tomorrow, they would board ships bound for the Pacific, heading toward islands most Americans had never heard of, toward battles that would test them in ways training never could. They would face death and deal it out in return. They would suffer and endure, bleed and persevere. Some would break under the strain, others would discover reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. But tonight, they were simply young men on the eve of their greatest adventure and greatest trial, united by duty, by training, by the invisible bonds of shared purpose. They were ordinary Americans who'd answered their nation's call, transformed by necessity into warriors, ready to write their own chapter in the story of their nation's response to infamy. The road ahead was long and bloody, but they would walk it together, and in doing so, prove that the sleeping giant awakened at Pearl Harbor was more formidable than any enemy had imagined. The USS Crescent City cut through the Pacific swells with determined purpose, her hull loaded with nearly 2,000 Marines heading toward an objective that had become the focal point of the entire war in the Pacific. Jimmy Harrison stood on deck, watching the endless expanse of ocean, feeling the salt spray on his face. Around him, his brothers in arms dealt with the voyage in their own ways. Some wrote letters they hoped would reach home. Others cleaned weapons already spotless, the repetitive motion providing comfort in the face of uncertainty. Many simply stared at the horizon, lost in private thoughts about what awaited them. The destination was Guadalcanal, a name none of them had known 6 months ago, now spoken with a mixture of determination and dread. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Japanese forces entrenched on the island, dense jungle terrain, tropical diseases that could kill as efficiently as bullets, and an enemy that had proven itself fanatical in its willingness to fight to the death. The Marines would be tasked with seizing an airfield the Japanese had been constructing, a strategic asset that could change the entire dynamic of the Pacific War. Tommy Chen sat nearby, methodically checking his gear for the 100th time. His brother William had been assigned to a different unit, headed to a different theater, and Tommy carried the weight of living up to the Chen family legacy. "You thinking about your brother?" Jimmy asked, settling down beside the younger man. Always, Tommy replied quietly. He wrote me before we shipped out, told me to trust my training, trust my unit, and never hesitate when the moment comes. He said hesitation gets people killed, either you or the man depending on you. Tommy's hands paused in their mechanical checking. I don't want to let anyone down, Jimmy. Not my family, not my unit, not my country. You won't, Jimmy said with conviction. I've watched you transform from that kid who could barely make it through a forced march into one of the best Marines in this unit. Your brother would be proud. Hell, I'm proud, and I'm not even related to you. Dreen. The transport convoy consisted of dozens of ships, a massive undertaking that represented America's growing might in the Pacific. Destroyers and cruisers provided escort, their crews at constant alert for Japanese submarines that prowled these waters. Fighter aircraft from carriers provided air cover, the distant drone of their engines a reminder that modern war encompassed sea, land, and sky. Everything about the operation spoke to the scale of commitment America had made to winning this war. Sergeant Chen, William's replacement in their unit after the original was reassigned, addressed the men on the evening before the planned landing. His name was Marcus Sullivan, a career Marine from Boston who'd fought in the previous war and knew intimately the horrors that awaited them. Listen up. His voice carried authority earned through decades of service. Tomorrow morning we hit the beach at Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggests we might catch them by surprise, but don't count on it. The Japanese are smart, disciplined, and absolutely committed to their cause. They'll fight for every inch of ground, and they don't surrender. He paused, letting that sink in. Some of you are thinking this is your chance to be heroes. Forget that nonsense. Heroes are what we call the lucky ones who survive doing their job. Your job is simple. Follow orders, support your squad, complete the objective. You see a Japanese soldier, you kill him before he kills you. No hesitation, no mercy, no second guessing. This isn't murder, it's war. And in war, the side that hesitates loses. The men absorbed his words in silence. The reality they'd trained for was now imminent. Tomorrow wouldn't be another drill or exercise. Tomorrow, people would try to kill them, and they would kill in return. The abstraction of war was giving way to its concrete, terrifying reality. Jimmy thought about the farm in Kansas, about his mother's face when he'd left, about Sally Henderson's letters tucked carefully in his pack. He thought about the men who died at Pearl Harbor, about the promise he'd made to their memory. He thought about America, not as an abstract concept, but as a collection of specific precious things: wheat fields golden under summer sun, church bells on Sunday morning, children playing baseball in dusty lots, the smell of his mother's apple pie cooling on the windowsill. These were the things worth fighting for, the things worth dying for if necessary. The night passed slowly. Few men slept. Some prayed, Catholics fingering rosaries, Protestants with heads bowed over well-worn Bibles, Jews reciting ancient prayers in whispered Hebrew. Others wrote final letters just in case, expressing things they'd been too proud or afraid to say before. Jimmy wrote to his mother, telling her he loved her, thanking her for raising him to understand duty and honor. He wrote to Sally, admitting feelings he'd kept carefully guarded, explaining that if something happened to him, she should know he'd treasured every letter, every memory of their time together. Dawn broke clear and bright on August 7th, 1942. The Solomon Islands materialized from the morning mist like something from a dream, lush, green, beautiful, and deadly. Guadalcanal rose from the sea, its volcanic peaks shrouded in clouds, its beaches pristine and untouched-looking. It seemed impossible that this tropical paradise would soon become a killing ground. The Marines assembled in the transport holds, checking each other's gear, offering final words of encouragement, making the small jokes that men make when facing death. "Try not to get shot in the ass, Rodriguez," someone called out. "It'd be a shame to ruin such a pretty target." The laughter was forced but necessary, a release of tension that threatened to become paralysis. "Load up!" The order echoed through the ship. Marines filed toward the landing craft, their equipment heavy, their movements mechanical from countless rehearsals. Jimmy felt his heart hammering in his chest, his mouth dry despite the humid air. This was it, the moment all their training had prepared them for. He thought briefly of Pearl Harbor, of the chaos and terror of that morning. But this was different. This time, they weren't victims responding to a surprise attack. This time, they were taking the fight to the enemy. The landing craft dropped from the transport ship into the waves below, motors roaring to life as coxswains maneuvered toward the beach. The sea was rougher than it appeared from the ship's deck, and the small craft pitched and rolled, sending several Marines to their knees, retching over the sides. The smell of vomit and diesel fuel mixed with the salt air. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Jimmy watched the shoreline grow closer, searching for any sign of enemy activity. The jungle beyond the beach looked impenetrable, a wall of green that could hide an army. Intelligence had suggested the Japanese weren't expecting an assault. But intelligence had been wrong before. Every instinct screamed that they were heading into a trap, that machine guns were waiting to open fire the moment they hit the beach. 30 seconds! The coxswain yelled. Marines gripped their rifles tighter, muscles tensing for the leap from boat to beach, for the sprint across open sand that would leave them hideously vulnerable. This was the nightmare scenario every amphibious assault faced. Men packed into slow-moving boats, unable to fight back, approaching a defended shoreline where even modest resistance could turn the landing into a slaughter. The landing craft hit sand, and the ramp dropped with a metallic clang that seemed impossibly loud. "Go! Go! Go!" Sergeant Sullivan's voice cut through Jimmy's fear, and suddenly he was moving, splashing through knee-deep water, running toward the beach with his rifle held high. Around him, Marines spread out in trained formations, each man searching for threats, expecting at any second the rip of machine gun fire that would tear through their ranks. But it didn't come. The beach was empty. The jungle remained silent. They'd achieved complete surprise. The Japanese forces on Guadalcanal hadn't anticipated an American offensive here, now, in such strength. For a few precious hours, the Marines would face minimal resistance as they pushed inland toward their objective, the nearly complete Japanese airfield that would soon be renamed Henderson Field. "Keep moving," Sullivan urged his men forward. "Don't bunch up. Maintain intervals. Just because we haven't been shot at yet doesn't mean we won't be." The Marines advanced cautiously into the jungle, their training taking over, their movements coordinated despite the fear and adrenaline coursing through their systems. The heat was overwhelming, a physical presence that seemed to press down from above while radiating up from the ground. Within minutes, every man was soaked with sweat, their uniforms clinging to their bodies, their breath coming in labored gasps. The jungle was unlike anything they'd trained for. Dense vegetation that limited visibility to yards, strange sounds from birds and insects, an oppressive humidity that made every breath feel like drowning. Tommy Chen moved through the jungle with surprising grace despite his smaller stature. His rifle swept methodically, covering his sector, his movements efficient and controlled. Jimmy felt a surge of pride, watching the young man perform exactly as trained. Fear transformed into focused competence. This was what good training produced. Not fearless men, but men who could function despite their fear. They reached the airfield by mid-morning, finding it nearly deserted. A handful of Japanese soldiers and construction workers fled at the sight of American forces, melting into the jungle rather than mounting a defense. The Marines quickly secured the area, establishing defensive positions, preparing for the counterattack that would inevitably come. The airfield was crude but functional, a long strip of packed earth that could accommodate fighters and light bombers. Once American engineers improved it and American aircraft occupied it, this field would become a crucial asset in the campaign to push Japanese forces back across the Pacific. But taking the airfield was just the beginning. Holding it would be the real test. Japanese forces on the island would undoubtedly attempt to retake it, and reinforcements would be rushed to Guadalcanal from throughout the region. The Marines had won the first round, but the fight was just beginning. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the Marines dug foxholes and established perimeter defenses. The jungle, beautiful in daylight, became menacing in darkness. Every sound might be an approaching enemy. Every shadow might conceal a threat. Sleep would be fitful at best, and many men wouldn't sleep at all. Jimmy sat in his foxhole, rifle across his lap, listening to the sounds of the jungle night. Somewhere out there, Japanese forces were regrouping, planning their response to this American incursion. Soon, perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow, they would attack. And when they did, the real battle for Guadalcanal would begin. "You okay?" Tommy whispered from the adjacent foxhole. "Yeah," Jimmy replied. "You?" "Scared shitless," Tommy admitted, "but ready. We did it, Jimmy. We're actually here, actually fighting back. My parents, they came to America for freedom, for opportunity. Now we're defending those things. It feels right, you know, like we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Jimmy understood completely. Despite the fear, despite knowing the horrors that awaited them in the days and weeks ahead, there was a sense of purpose that transcended personal comfort or safety. They were part of something larger than themselves, a fight not just for territory or strategic advantage, but for the very principles upon which their nation was founded. In this steaming jungle on a remote Pacific island, ordinary Americans were becoming the guardians of extraordinary ideals. The night passed with agonizing slowness. Every sound brought Marines to full alert, fingers on triggers, hearts racing, but the expected attack didn't materialize. The Japanese were regrouping, gathering forces, planning a coordinated assault rather than a hasty, piecemeal response. The respite gave the Marines time to strengthen their positions, but it also allowed dread to build, imagination to paint increasingly horrific scenarios of what would come when the battle finally began. 2 weeks passed in a blur of exhausting labor and constant vigilance. The Marines strengthened their defensive positions around Henderson Field, stringing barbed wire, digging deeper foxholes, positioning machine guns and artillery to cover every likely avenue of approach. Engineers worked around the clock to improve the airfield, and on August 20th, the first American aircraft landed, Marine fighters and dive bombers that would provide crucial air support in the battles to come. The sight of those planes touching down on Guadalcanal soil sent a surge of pride through every man present. They weren't alone anymore. But Japanese forces hadn't been idle. Intelligence reports, gathered from captured documents and interrogation of prisoners, indicated that enemy reinforcements had been landing at night, moving through the jungle to positions east of the American perimeter. The Marines knew an attack was coming. The only questions were when and in what strength. The answer came on the night of August 21st, 1942. Jimmy was on perimeter watch, positioned behind a sandbagged machine gun emplacement on the east side of the defensive line, near a small stream the Marines called Alligator Creek, but which maps would later identify as the Ilu River. The jungle before him was dark as pitch, the oppressive blackness broken only occasionally by the brief glow of heat lightening on the horizon. Insects swarmed in clouds, and the heat remained stifling even after sunset. Sweat soaked through Jimmy's uniform, and he fought the constant urge to scratch at the dozens of insect bites covering his exposed skin. Tommy Chen was positioned 20 yards to Jimmy's left, manning another machine gun with Rodriguez and Parker. They'd become a tight unit over the past 2 weeks, their training bonds forged stronger by shared hardship and constant danger. Every patrol into the jungle brought the possibility of ambush. Every night brought the fear of infiltrators cutting throats in the darkness. They'd lost men, not many, but enough to make the danger real, to transform the abstract concept of death in combat into the concrete reality of empty bunks and personal effects being packed for shipment home. Around 0200 hours, a figure emerged from the jungle on the American side of the perimeter, a native Solomon Islander, his body covered in blood and cuts. He was immediately challenged by sentries, but he called out in broken English, "Japanese, many Japanese, coming soon." This was Jacob Vuza, a local scout working with the Americans, and his warning would prove crucial. Vuza had been captured by Japanese forces, tortured for information about American positions, and left for dead. But the extraordinary man had chewed through his bonds and crawled back to warn the Marines, despite wounds that should have killed him. His courage embodied the spirit of the local people who'd chosen to support American forces against the Japanese occupation. A reminder that this wasn't just an American fight, but a struggle that affected millions throughout the Pacific. Minutes after Vuza's warning, the jungle erupted with activity. Through the darkness came sounds that made Jimmy's blood run cold. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of men moving through the dense vegetation, no longer attempting stealth, their approach marked by snapping branches and shouted commands in Japanese. Then came a sound that would haunt Jimmy's nightmares for the rest of his life. "Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!" A war cry rose from hundreds of throats, a collective roar of defiance and fanatical determination. "Here they come!" Sergeant Sullivan's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your fire until you have clear targets. Make every shot count." Marines tensed behind their weapons, fingers on triggers, hearts pounding, as the first wave of Japanese soldiers burst from the jungle into the open ground before the American positions. They came in waves, hundreds of men charging directly into American machine gun and rifle fire, with a courage that bordered on insanity. These weren't tactical advances. They were human wave attacks, suicidal charges meant to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers and ferocity. The Japanese soldiers screamed as they ran, some firing their rifles from the hip, others holding bayonets fixed, all of them seemingly heedless of the withering fire that tore through their ranks. Jimmy's machine gun roared to life, the weapon bucking against his shoulder as he poured fire into the charging mass of humanity. Beside him, Washington fed ammunition belts with practiced efficiency, calling out encouragements. "That's it, Jimmy. Keep firing. Don't let them reach the wire." The traces from American machine guns created interlocking lanes of death, each burst cutting down multiple attackers. Men fell by the dozens, but more kept coming, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, driven by a fanatical determination that defied rational understanding. To Jimmy's left, Tommy Chen's machine gun added its voice to the symphony of destruction. The young Marine fired in controlled bursts, exactly as trained, his weapons sweeping back and forth to cover his entire sector. When Japanese soldiers broke through a gap in the wire, Tommy shifted fire immediately, cutting them down before they could exploit the breach. Rodriguez and Parker supported him with rifle fire, picking off individual targets that somehow survived the machine gun fusillade. The battle devolved into chaos. Some Japanese soldiers reached the American positions, leaping into foxholes where Marines fought them with knives, entrenching tools, bare hands, anything that could kill. Jimmy watched in horror as a Japanese soldier bayoneted Thompson, a Marine from Georgia who'd shared his rations just hours earlier. Before the attacker could withdraw his blade, Washington shot him at point-blank range, then helped drag Thompson's body back from the fighting line. There was no time to check if he was alive or dead. The attack continued without pause. Artillery fire began falling on the jungle beyond the creek. called in by forward observers who directed the big guns with deadly precision. The 105mm shells exploded among Japanese forces, still staging for their assault, turning the jungle into a killing ground of fire and shrapnel. But still they came, wave after wave, their officers driving them forward with swords and pistols. The Bushido code of the samurai warped into something that turned men into expendable weapons. For over an hour, the battle raged with an intensity that beggared description. Jimmy's machine gun barrel glowed red from continuous firing, forcing him to pour precious water over it to prevent catastrophic failure. His hands were blistered from handling hot metal. His ears rang from the constant gunfire. His eyes burned from smoke and cordite. But he kept firing because to stop was to die, to let his brothers down, to fail in the mission that had brought them to this hellish place. The Japanese attack finally began to falter as dawn approached. The human waves became smaller, more disorganized. Bodies lay heaped before the American positions, so many that the sight seemed impossible, like something from hell itself. As light crept across the battlefield, the Marines could see the full scope of the slaughter. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead, their fanatical courage proving no match for entrenched positions and overwhelming firepower. But the battle wasn't over. Sergeant Sullivan assembled a counterattack force, determined to pursue the surviving Japanese soldiers and prevent them from regrouping. Harrison, Chen, Washington, Rodriguez, Parker, you're with me. We're going to sweep the far side of the creek and make sure there are no pockets of resistance. 20 Marines in total, they advanced cautiously across the killing ground, weapons ready, expecting ambush at any moment. The scene beyond the creek defied comprehension. Japanese soldiers lay everywhere, in the water, tangled in vegetation, sprawled in the mud. Some were clearly dead, their bodies torn apart by machine gun fire or shredded by artillery. Others were wounded, crying out in Japanese for water, for help, for their mothers. The Marines moved through this landscape of death with weapons raised, knowing that wounded Japanese soldiers had been known to detonate grenades when Americans approached, preferring death to the dishonor of capture. Tommy Chen paused beside a dying Japanese officer, a colonel based on his insignia. The man's hand moved toward his sword, but he lacked the strength to draw it. His eyes met Tommy's, and for a moment they weren't enemies separated by ideology and nationality, but simply two young men caught in war's terrible machinery. Then the light faded from the Japanese officer's eyes, and he was gone. "Keep moving," Sullivan ordered, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Don't dwell on it. What's done is done." They continued their sweep, finding no organized resistance, only isolated wounded, and the bodies of men who'd charged to their deaths under orders that doomed them from the start. The final tally would later reveal that over 800 Japanese soldiers had died in the assault, while American casualties numbered less than 50. It was a victory, but one that brought no joy. The Marines had proven they could hold their positions against overwhelming odds and fanatical attacks. They demonstrated that courage and determination without tactical intelligence and proper support was suicide. The Japanese High Command would learn from this disaster, sending larger forces with better planning in future attempts to retake Henderson Field. But for now, on this morning after the Battle of Tenaru, the Americans had held. Jimmy sat on the edge of his foxhole, staring at his hands. They trembled uncontrollably, his body finally responding to the trauma of the past hours. He'd killed men, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, given how many had charged into his machine gun fire. He'd watched friends die. He'd seen courage and madness intertwined so completely they became indistinguishable. And he knew, with terrible certainty, that this was just one battle in what would be a long, bloody campaign. Tommy Chen approached, his face pale but composed. "We did it, Jimmy. We held them." His voice carried wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe they'd survived. "Yeah," Jimmy replied quietly. We held them. But there'll be more. The Japanese won't give up. They'll keep coming, keep attacking, until either we're driven off this island or they're defeated completely. No middle ground, no negotiation. Just fighting until one side can't fight anymore. Washington joined them, offering canteens of water that tasted like salvation. Y'all saved my life back there, he said, his Alabama accent thick with emotion. That machine gun nest was getting overrun, and you shifted fire just in time. I won't forget it. We're brothers, Jimmy said simply. We take care of each other. That's how we survive this. He looked around at the exhausted, traumatized men who'd fought through the night and emerged victorious. They'd been tested in the furnace of combat and proven their mettle. Ordinary Americans from farms and cities, from every background and region, united by duty and transformed by necessity into warriors capable of extraordinary things. The sun rose higher, bringing with it the oppressive heat that would make the day a misery. Engineers and corpsmen moved through the battlefield, collecting American wounded and dead, leaving the Japanese casualties for burial details that would work through the coming days. Aircraft took off from Henderson Field, heading out on patrol, the drone of their engines a reminder that the war extended beyond this single island, this single battle. Sergeant Sullivan gathered his squad for a brief address. His face was haggard, aged by the night's horrors, but his voice remained steady. You performed exceptionally. Every man did his duty and then some. We held against odds that should have overrun us, and we did it because we trusted each other, because we refused to break. The Japanese learned tonight that Americans don't scare easily, don't quit when things get hard. They learned that attacking us head-on is suicide. Most importantly, we learned that we can win this war, not easily, not without terrible cost, but we can win. He paused, his eyes moving across each face. Get some rest, clean your weapons. Write letters home if you want. Tell your families you're okay, though don't go into details about what happened here. In a few days or a week, we'll do this again. And then again after that. That's the reality of Guadalcanal. Constant fighting, constant vigilance, constant danger. But we're Marines, this is what we signed up for, whether we knew it or not. Now we know what we're made of. Now we know we can handle whatever comes next. Jimmy lay down in his foxhole, using his pack as a pillow, and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly despite the heat and the memories of the night. His last conscious thought was of his mother, praying for him in Kansas, unaware of what her son had endured and done. He hoped she'd be proud. He hoped his actions honored the values she'd instilled in him. He hoped, when this war finally ended, he'd be able to return home and find peace. But that was for the future. For now, there was only the mission, the unit, and the grim determination to see it through to the end. September brought new horrors to Guadalcanal, though they came not from enemy action, but from nature itself. The rainy season arrived with a vengeance, transforming the island into a fever-ridden swamp. Water pooled everywhere, creating ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes that descended in clouds so thick they seemed to darken the air. With them came malaria, a disease that would prove nearly as deadly as Japanese bullets. Jimmy Harrison felt the first symptoms 3 weeks after the Battle of Tarawa. It started with chills despite the oppressive heat, his body shaking so violently his teeth chattered. Then came the fever, spiking so high that colors seemed too bright, sounds too loud, reality itself warping at the edges. The Navy corpsman, a young man from Ohio named Miller, who'd proven himself invaluable during the fighting, recognized the signs immediately. Malaria, Miller said, his voice carrying grim certainty. You're the 5th case today, Jimmy. Take these. He handed over small yellow pills, Atabrine, the anti-malaria drug that rumor claimed would render men sterile. Many Marines refused to take it, preferring to risk the disease rather than imagined impotence. But Jimmy had seen what malaria did to men, watched them waste away until they resembled walking skeletons. He swallowed the pills without protest. The disease ravaged him for 3 days. Fever alternated with chills in cycles that left him disoriented and weak. He hallucinated during the worst moments, saw his mother standing at the edge of his foxhole telling him to come home, saw Sally Henderson reaching for him with hands that dissolved into smoke when he tried to touch them. He dreamed of wheat fields that turned to jungle, of machines that fired endless streams of bodies instead of bullets, of Japanese soldiers who spoke with his father's voice, asking why he'd killed them. When the fever finally broke, Jimmy was 20 pounds lighter and weak as a kitten, but he was alive, and more importantly, he was still combat effective by Guadalcanal's brutal standards. General Vandergrift had issued an order that no Marine would be excused from duty unless his temperature exceeded 103 degrees. Men fought with fevers, commanded operations while delirious, manned machine guns while shaking with malarial chills. There was no choice. The Japanese kept attacking, and every able body was needed on the line. Tommy Chen had contracted malaria a week before Jimmy had already recovered and returned to duty. The disease had carved away whatever softness remained from his civilian life, leaving behind something harder, leaner, more dangerous. His eyes had changed. They carried the 1,000-yard stare that marked men who'd seen too much death, dealt too much of it themselves. Yet when he smiled, which was rare now, something of the earnest young man who'd wanted to make his family proud still showed through. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Tommy greeted Jimmy on his first day back at his post. "Thought we might lose you for a while there. You were talking crazy during the fever, saying things about wheat and your mother and someone named Sally." Jimmy felt his face flush. Fever dreams. Nothing that made sense. "Made perfect sense to me," Tommy replied quietly. "We all have people and places we're fighting for. That's what keeps us going when everything else says to quit." He paused, checking the jungle before them with automatic vigilance. "We've got orders, by the way. Big operation coming. Japs are planning another major push to retake Henderson Field, and we're moving to defensive positions on a ridge south of here." The ridge in question was a coral spine running roughly north-south about a mile south of Henderson Field. It offered commanding views of the approaches to the airfield, making it crucial terrain. If the Japanese broke through there, they'd have a clear path to the airstrip, and losing Henderson Field meant losing Guadalcanal. The defense of this ridge would fall primarily to the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion, elite units led by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, a man whose tactical genius and fierce determination had earned him the nickname Red Mike. Jimmy's unit moved into position on September 12th, digging foxholes in the coral spine, positioning machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, stringing barbed wire across likely avenues of approach. The work was exhausting in the heat and humidity, made worse by the knowledge that Japanese forces were gathering in the jungle below, preparing for what everyone knew would be a massive assault. Intelligence gathered from a recent raid on a Japanese supply base at Tazimboko suggested that thousands of enemy soldiers were converging on this sector. As darkness fell on the night of September 12th, the Marines waited with weapons ready and nerves stretched to breaking. The jungle below them was alive with sound, birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional crack of a branch that might be wind or might be enemy scouts probing their positions. Artillery had pre-registered coordinates, ready to drop shells on any Japanese concentration. Naval vessels offshore stood ready to provide fire support. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Now came the waiting, which was always the hardest part. The attack began around 2100 hours with an artillery barrage that crashed into Marine positions with devastating accuracy. Shells exploded among the foxholes, throwing coral fragments like shrapnel, the concussions stunning men and collapsing defensive positions. Then came the infantry, wave after wave of Japanese soldiers emerging from the jungle, their battle cries echoing across the ridge. "Banzai! Marines, you die! Banzai!" Jimmy's machine gun opened up immediately, pouring fire into the advancing mass. Beside him, Washington fed ammunition while calling out targets. "Left side, 20 yards. Bunch of them at the wire. Got 'em. More coming right side." The tracers from their gun joined dozens of others, creating a web of death that cut down attackers by the score. But still they came, climbing over their dead, pushing forward with a determination that seemed superhuman. To Jimmy's right, Tommy Chen's position came under heavy pressure. A Japanese mortar round landed directly in front of his foxhole, the explosion temporarily silencing his machine gun. Jimmy's heart seized. For a moment, he was certain Tommy was dead. Then he heard the young Marine's voice, hoarse but defiant. "I'm okay, gun's damaged, switching to rifle." Moments later, Tommy's M1 Garand joined the defensive fire, each shot carefully aimed, each one finding a target. The fighting continued through the night, with an intensity that made the Battle of Tenaru seem almost mild by comparison. The Japanese employed new tactics, small groups infiltrating between positions, trying to roll up the Marine line from the flanks. Hand-to-hand combat broke out in multiple locations as Japanese soldiers reached the foxholes, and Marines fought them with knives, bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare hands. The ridge became a slaughterhouse, illuminated by muzzle flashes and explosions, the air thick with smoke and the copper smell of blood. Colonel Edson moved among his men throughout the battle, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. When one position began to waver under overwhelming pressure, he was there, voice cutting through the din. "Hold this line! If you give an inch, they'll take a mile! Fight, damn you! Fight!" His courage was infectious. Men who'd been on the verge of breaking found new reserves of strength, inspired by their commander's refusal to accept defeat. Around 0300 hours, Japanese forces achieved a breakthrough on the eastern side of the ridge. A company of Marines was forced to fall back, leaving a gap that enemy soldiers immediately exploited. For a terrible moment, it seemed the entire position might collapse. But Edson rallied reserves, personally leading a counterattack that drove the Japanese back in brutal close-quarters combat. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red. Artillery dropped shells danger close to American positions, the concussions stunning friend and foe alike, but breaking the momentum of the Japanese assault. Jimmy fought through the night in a state beyond exhaustion, beyond fear, operating on pure instinct and training. His machine gun ran dry multiple times, and each time Washington loaded fresh ammunition with hands that never stopped moving despite wounds from coral fragments. When Japanese soldiers got close enough to throw grenades, Jimmy threw them back, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Shrapnel opened a gash on his shoulder, but the pain seemed distant, irrelevant compared to the immediate need to keep firing, keep fighting, keep holding. The dawn of September 13th brought no respite. The Japanese, having failed to break through during the night, regrouped for another assault. They came again in the afternoon, this time with better coordination and heavier artillery support. The Marines, exhausted and depleted, held their positions through sheer determination. Tommy Chen, fighting now with a captured Japanese rifle after running out of ammunition for his M1, accounted for over a dozen enemy soldiers during this phase of the battle. Rodriguez, despite a serious leg wound, refused evacuation and continued directing fire from his foxhole. Parker, the former bookworm from Philadelphia, earned a battlefield promotion after taking command of his squad when their sergeant was killed. The second night was, if possible, worse than the first. The Japanese launched human wave attacks in the darkness, screaming their battle cries, firing rifles from the hip, determined to overwhelm the American positions through sheer numbers and fanatical courage. But the Marines had found something within themselves, a stubbornness that matched Japanese fanaticism, a refusal to break that transcended normal human limitations. They were defending not just a ridge or an airfield, but the idea that free men could stand against tyranny and prevail. By dawn of September 14th, the Japanese assault had failed. Bodies littered the slopes of the ridge in numbers that beggared description. Between 700 and 800 enemy dead, compared to just over 100 American casualties. The disparity told the story of the battle, well-positioned defenders with overwhelming firepower, defeating courage and determination that lacked tactical intelligence. The Japanese had fought with incredible bravery, but bravery alone couldn't overcome machine guns, artillery and marines, who absolutely refused to yield. Jimmy sat in his foxhole as morning light revealed the full scope of the carnage. His machine gun was damaged beyond field repair, its barrel warped from continuous firing. His hands were burned and blistered, his shoulder wound had clotted but would need proper medical attention. But he was alive. Washington was alive. Tommy Chen was alive, though barely. The young Marine had taken shrapnel in his side and had been operating on willpower alone for the past 12 hours. Corpsman Miller worked his way along the line, treating wounded men with supplies nearly exhausted. When he reached Tommy, his face went pale. "Chen, you should be dead. This wound, how are you still conscious?" "Can't die yet," Tommy replied, his voice weak but carrying a ghost of humor. "Haven't made my brother proud enough yet. Haven't proven myself." He looked at Jimmy, his eyes clear despite the pain. "We held, right? We held the ridge?" "We held," Jimmy confirmed, gripping his friend's hand. "You were incredible, Tommy. Your brother, your whole family. They should be proud. Hell, I'm proud to have fought beside you." Miller administered morphine and began treating the wound, but even he could see it was serious. "You need to be evacuated, Chen. This is beyond what I can handle in the field." "Then evacuate me," Tommy said simply. "But first tell me we won. Tell me it mattered." "It mattered." Colonel Edson himself appeared, having overheard the exchange. He knelt beside Tommy's foxhole, his face haggard, but his eyes bright with pride. "Every one of you mattered. What you did here, what all of you did, this will be remembered. Generations will know that on this ridge, Marines stood against overwhelming odds and did not break." The Japanese thought Americans were soft, materialistic, lacking the spiritual strength for this kind of fight. You proved them catastrophically wrong. He stood, addressing all the survivors within earshot. "This ridge will bear my name in the reports, but it belongs to you, every man who fought here, every man who held his position when everything demanded he run. You saved Henderson Field, you saved Guadalcanal, and in doing so, you may have saved the entire Pacific campaign." As Tommy was carried off on a stretcher toward the field hospital, Jimmy watched him go and felt something shift inside himself. They'd arrived on Guadalcanal as trained soldiers. They were leaving, those who survived, as something more. Warriors, yes, but also guardians of something precious and increasingly rare in the modern world. The knowledge that ordinary men, properly motivated and led, could accomplish extraordinary things. The ridge would indeed be renamed Edson's Ridge, but among those who fought there, it would always be remembered as Bloody Ridge, the place where American Marines proved that determination, training, and refusal to accept defeat could overcome even the most fanatical enemy. It was a lesson the Japanese would learn again and again as the war progressed. Each lesson written in blood on Pacific islands with unpronounceable names. October and November brought a grinding war of attrition to Guadalcanal. The Japanese, refusing to accept their defeats, poured reinforcements onto the island through a supply system the Marines had nicknamed the Tokyo Express. High-speed destroyer runs that delivered troops and supplies under cover of darkness, then withdrew before dawn, could expose them to American air attack. The Americans, for their part, continued building up Henderson Field and reinforcing their defensive perimeter, turning Guadalcanal into an anvil upon which Japanese ambitions in the Pacific would be broken. Jimmy Harrison had recovered from his malaria and wounds, though he'd never fully regained the weight he'd lost. None of them would. Malnutrition, disease, and constant stress had transformed the Marines into lean, hard men who bore little resemblance to the fresh-faced recruits who'd landed 3 months earlier. They moved through the jungle with predatory efficiency, fought with cold competence born of experience, and carried in their eyes the weight of everything they'd seen and done. News arrived in late October that Tommy Chen had been evacuated to a hospital in Australia. His wounds had been more serious than initially thought, and infection had nearly killed him before doctors finally brought it under control. The letter Tommy sent from his hospital bed was characteristically brief. "Still alive. Still proud to be a Marine. Tell everyone I'll be back as soon as they let me. Keep fighting. Make it count." Jimmy kept that letter folded in his pocket, reading it during quiet moments, drawing strength from his friend's indomitable spirit. The Cactus Air Force, the nickname for the collection of Marine, Navy, and eventually Army aircraft operating from Henderson Field, had become crucial to holding Guadalcanal. The pilots flew missions from dawn to dusk, attacking Japanese supply convoys, bombing enemy positions, and engaging in desperate dogfights against superior numbers. Their aircraft were often patched together from cannibalized parts, fueled with precious gasoline brought in by submarine and convoy, armed with whatever ordnance was available. Yet they flew mission after impossible mission, their presence making it impossible for the Japanese to operate freely during daylight hours. Jimmy watched them take off and land, marveling at their courage. The pilots faced death every time they climbed into their cockpits, knew that a single bullet in the fuel tank or engine could send them spinning into the sea or jungle below. Yet they flew without hesitation, understanding that the Marines on the ground depended on them, that Henderson Field's survival depended on maintaining air superiority. He'd made friends with several pilots, Lieutenant Carson from Texas, Ensign Williams from Michigan, Captain Rodriguez from New Mexico. All three would be dead by November's end, their aircraft shot down in combat or lost to mechanical failure, their sacrifices measured in days added to Guadalcanal's survival. The nights brought terror of a different kind. Japanese warships began regular bombardment runs, their massive guns hurling shells into the American perimeter with devastating accuracy. The bombardment on the night of October 13th-14th was particularly horrific. 2 Japanese battleships, Congo and Haruna, spent 90 minutes systematically destroying Henderson Field. The 14-inch shells turned aircraft into scrap metal, collapsed bunkers, cratered the runway, and killed dozens of Marines who could only huddle in their foxholes and pray the next shell didn't have their name on it. Jimmy endured that bombardment in a state of controlled terror. The shells made a distinctive sound as they approached, a freight train roar that gave perhaps 2 seconds of warning before the explosion. Men who'd fought bravely in ground combat broke under this bombardment, the helplessness of being unable to fight back, corroding their courage. Washington, who'd never shown fear during the fiercest firefights, wept openly as the shells fell. Rodriguez, still recovering from his leg wound, curled into a fetal position and sang Spanish prayers his grandmother had taught him. Parker simply stared into space, his mind apparently gone somewhere else to escape the present horror. When dawn finally came and the bombardment ceased, Henderson Field looked like a moonscape, cratered, burning, seemingly destroyed beyond repair. But within hours, engineers and ground crews were already at work, filling craters, salvaging damaged aircraft, patching the runway with pierced steel planking and coral. By afternoon, aircraft were taking off again, somehow coaxed into the air by mechanics who worked miracles with inadequate tools and parts. The resilience of the Americans seemed to break something in Japanese planning. They couldn't understand how forces they'd just devastated could be operational again so quickly. The ground battles continued with monotonous regularity. Japanese forces probed the American perimeter nightly, seeking weak points, trying to infiltrate past defensive positions. Some attacks were small, a handful of soldiers attempting to sneak through the wire. Others were substantial, coordinated assaults involving hundreds of men. Each attack was repulsed, but each cost American lives, added to the cumulative toll of exhaustion and trauma that wore down even the strongest men. November brought the climactic naval battle of Guadalcanal, a series of engagements so violent and desperate that they would determine the island's fate. Intelligence indicated that a major Japanese convoy was heading toward Guadalcanal, carrying 7,000 troops, enough to potentially overwhelm the American defenders if they landed successfully. To prevent this, American naval forces moved to intercept, setting up a confrontation that would become one of the war's most decisive naval engagements. The Marines on Guadalcanal could only watch from shore as the battle unfolded in the waters around them. The night sky lit up with gunfire and explosions as American and Japanese ships clashed at close range in a brutal melee. Jimmy stood at the perimeter with his unit, listening to the thunder of naval guns, seeing the flashes on the horizon, knowing that the outcome of this battle would determine whether they held Guadalcanal or died trying. The battle lasted 3 days and nights, a rolling thunder of destruction that involved battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft from both sides. When it finally ended on November 15th, the Americans had won a strategic victory despite heavy losses. 2 American admirals, Callahan and Scott, had been killed in action, the only U.S. Navy flag officers lost in a surface engagement during the entire war. Multiple ships had been sunk or damaged on both sides, but critically, the Japanese troopship convoy had been destroyed, most of the transports sent to the bottom with their human cargo. Those troops that managed to beach on Guadalcanal did so without equipment or supplies, and many died of starvation in the following weeks. News of the naval victory spread through the Marine positions like wildfire. Men who'd been fighting on a knife's edge of exhaustion and despair suddenly found new energy, new hope. The Japanese had thrown everything at Guadalcanal: banzai charges, infiltration tactics, naval bombardments, massive reinforcement convoys, and all had been defeated. The tide was turning, though there would be much hard fighting ahead before the island was truly secure. Sergeant Sullivan gathered Jimmy's unit for a briefing in late November. His face showed the strain of 4 months of continuous combat, but his voice remained steady. "You've probably heard rumors about the naval battle, about the Japanese convoy being turned back. It's all true. We've reached a turning point here. The Japanese can't reinforce Guadalcanal fast enough to replace their losses, can't supply the troops already here, can't contest our air superiority during daylight hours. They're starving in the jungle, dying of disease, losing the will to continue offensive operations." He paused, letting that sink in. "But don't think this means it's over. Desperate men are dangerous men, and the Japanese have proven they'll fight to the death rather than surrender. We've still got hard weeks ahead, maybe months. Patrols will continue. Defensive operations will continue. The enemy will keep attacking until they physically can't anymore. But we've proven something crucial. We can take it. Whatever they throw at us, we can endure it and throw it back harder. That's the real victory of Guadalcanal. Not the territory, not the airfield, though both matter, but the proof that Americans won't break, won't quit, won't accept defeat." Jimmy thought about that as he cleaned his rifle that evening. They'd arrived on Guadalcanal as soldiers. They'd become veterans through blood and sacrifice. They'd lost friends, good men who deserved to see home again, but who now lay in hastily dug graves, marked with simple wooden crosses. Thompson, who'd been bayoneted during the Battle of Tenaru, Davis, who'd taken shrapnel during Edson's Ridge, Williams and Carson and Rodriguez, pilots who'd bought them precious days with their lives. The list went on, each name carrying weight, each loss a wound that would never fully heal. But they'd also discovered something precious, the knowledge that they could endure the unendurable, achieve the impossible, stand against forces that should have overwhelmed them. They'd proven that free men fighting for a just cause could defeat tyranny backed by fanatical devotion. They'd written their own chapter in American history, one that would inspire future generations facing their own trials. A letter arrived from Tommy Chen in early December. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were pure Tommy. Heard about the naval battle. Heard we're winning. Wish I was there with you, but doctors say I need more recovery time. Tell everyone I'm proud of them. Tell them the Chen family is proud. My brother William is fighting in North Africa now. The war's being won on multiple fronts, and Americans are leading the way everywhere. When I get back to combat, and I will get back, I want to make sure I'm worthy of serving alongside heroes like all of you. Stay strong. Stay alive. We're going to win this war. Jimmy shared the letter with his squad, watching as hardened combat veterans smiled at Tommy's words. Washington laughed his first genuine laugh in weeks. Rodriguez crossed himself and offered a prayer for Tommy's continued recovery. Parker, who'd become the unit's de facto leader after proving himself repeatedly in combat, simply said, "That kid's got more heart than men twice his size. We're going to make sure he has a victory to come back to." As December advanced, the Japanese presence on Guadalcanal began to collapse. Starvation, disease, and continuous combat had reduced their forces to shadows of their former strength. The Tokyo Express runs became evacuation missions, pulling out the surviving troops rather than reinforcing them. The Marines conducted aggressive patrols, pushing the Japanese back, reclaiming territory, establishing dominance over the entire island. Jimmy participated in these final operations with grim determination. There was no glory in hunting down starving, desperate men, but it was necessary work. Every Japanese soldier eliminated was one less threat to American forces, one less enemy to face in future battles on other islands. War had stripped away romantic notions of combat, leaving only the brutal arithmetic of survival. Kill or be killed, destroy the enemy's capability to resist, accomplish the mission regardless of cost. On December 9th, exactly 4 months after the initial landing, Jimmy stood at Henderson Field and watched a formal ceremony marking the official end of major combat operations on Guadalcanal. The American flag flew over an airfield that had been baptized in blood, defended against impossible odds, and held through sheer determination. Aircraft took off and landed on runways that had been shelled, bombed, and repeatedly repaired. The perimeter that Marines had died defending now extended across most of the island. General Vandergrift addressed the assembled Marines, his words carrying the weight of hard-won victory. "When we landed on this island, many doubted we could hold it. The Japanese certainly doubted it. They expected to push us back into the sea within days. But you proved them wrong. Through courage, sacrifice, and an absolutely unbreakable will to prevail, you held Guadalcanal. You saved Henderson Field. You turned the tide of the Pacific War. Historians will debate strategy and tactics, but I'll tell you what really won this campaign. American Marines who refused to quit. You are, every one of you, part of a victory that will echo through the ages." Jimmy felt pride mixed with exhaustion and loss. They'd won, yes, but the cost had been terrible. Of the men who'd landed with him in August, less than half remained combat effective. The rest were dead, evacuated with wounds, or so ravaged by disease and trauma that they'd never fully recover. Victory felt less like triumph and more like survival. They'd endured something that should have destroyed them, and now carried the burden of living with what they'd seen and done. That night, sitting in his foxhole one last time before the unit rotated off the island, Jimmy wrote a letter home. He told his mother he was safe, told her he loved her, told her he'd be coming home eventually, though he didn't know when. He didn't tell her about the nightmares, about the faces of men he'd killed, about the friends who'd died in his arms. Some things couldn't be written, couldn't be shared with those who hadn't lived through it. He wrote to Sally Henderson, finally allowing himself to imagine a future beyond the war. He described Guadalcanal not as it was, but as he wanted to remember it, a place where ordinary Americans had become heroes, where courage had overcome terror, where the best of the American spirit had shone through the darkness of war. He proposed marriage in that letter, asking her to wait for him, promising that when he came home, he'd spend every day proving himself worthy of her patience and faith. As dawn broke over Guadalcanal on December 10th, Jimmy Harrison prepared to leave the island that had transformed him. He was no longer a farm boy from Kansas. He was a combat veteran, a Marine who'd fought in some of the war's most desperate battles and emerged scarred but unbroken. Ahead lay more islands, more battles, more tests of courage and endurance. But he'd learned the most important lesson war could teach, that ordinary men, properly motivated and led, could accomplish extraordinary things. That knowledge would sustain him through everything yet to come. The year 1943 brought Jimmy Harrison to Australia for rest and recuperation, though rest was a relative term. The Marines who'd survived Guadalcanal were given several months to recover from malaria, gain back lost weight, and process the trauma of what they'd experienced. But even as they recovered physically, training continued. New tactics were developed based on hard lessons learned in the jungles. Equipment was improved, doctrine refined, units reinforced with fresh replacements who'd never seen combat but would soon face their own baptism of fire. Tommy Chen rejoined the unit in June, his wounds healed but leaving scars that would mark him for life. He was thinner, moved with a slight limp that would never fully disappear, but his eyes still carried that fierce determination that had made him such an exceptional Marine. The reunion with Jimmy was emotional. Two men who'd become brothers through shared combat, who'd saved each other's lives, who carried memories no one else could understand. "Heard you propose to Sally," Tommy said during their first evening together, sharing drinks in a bar in Melbourne. "That took guts, considering we're headed back into combat." "Had to," Jimmy replied quietly. "Guadalcanal taught me that tomorrow isn't guaranteed. If I wanted her to know how I felt, I had to tell her while I still could. She said yes, by the way. We're getting married when this war's over, assuming we both make it home." "You'll make it," Tommy said with conviction. "You're too stubborn to die, Harrison. Besides, someone needs to tell our grandkids what we did here, make sure they understand the cost of freedom." He paused, his expression darkening. "My brother William was killed in North Africa, tank engagement near Tunisia. My parents—" His voice broke slightly. "They've lost one son to this war. I have to survive for them. I have to make William's sacrifice mean something." Jimmy gripped his friend's shoulder, knowing there were no adequate words. Loss was everywhere. Every unit had empty slots where friends used to be. Every mail call brought news of death from other theaters. The war had become a grinding attrition, consuming young men by the thousands, and all they could do was keep fighting, keep surviving, keep pushing toward victory, no matter how distant it seemed. Training intensified as November approached. The Marines learned they'd be part of Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. Intelligence briefings painted a grim picture. Tarawa's main island of Betio was barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, defended by 4,500 Japanese troops who'd spent months fortifying every inch with concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, and beach obstacles. Japanese Admiral Shibasaki had boasted that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines would have 76 hours to prove him wrong. The tactical challenges were immense. Betio was surrounded by a coral reef that extended up to 800 yards from shore. Landing craft would need to cross this reef to reach the beach, and intelligence suggested the tide might not be high enough for most boats to clear it. The Marines would potentially have to wade ashore through chest-deep water while under fire from well-positioned defenders, a nightmare scenario that violated every principle of amphibious warfare. But the decision had been made at the highest levels. Tarawa was strategically vital, its airfield necessary for the next phase of the Central Pacific campaign. The operation would proceed regardless of the risks. The Marines, as always, would do what was asked of them, pay whatever price was necessary, and accomplish their mission or die trying. Jimmy stood on the deck of the transport ship as it approached Tarawa on the morning of November 20th, 1943. The pre-invasion bombardment had been going on for hours, Navy battleships and cruisers hurling shells at the tiny island, aircraft dropping bombs, the combined firepower enough to seemingly destroy every living thing on Betio. The island disappeared behind a wall of smoke and flame, and some Marines dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the bombardment would do its job, and they'd face minimal resistance. Those hopes died the moment the landing craft approached the reef. The tide hadn't risen. The ocean seemed to be at neap tide, providing only about 3 feet of water over the reef, instead of the 5 feet needed for the Higgins boats to pass. Only the tracked amphibious vehicles, LVTs or alligators, could make it across. The conventional landing craft grounded on the reef, forcing Marines to climb out and wade toward shore through hundreds of yards of open water. Japanese defensive positions, protected in concrete bunkers that had survived the bombardment, opened fire immediately. Machine guns, rifles, and artillery turned the lagoon into a killing ground. Marines fell by the dozens, cut down in water-stained red with their blood. Some made it to the beach, only to find themselves pinned against a sea wall, unable to advance, taking casualties from Japanese positions they couldn't see or suppress. The LVTs that did make it in were systematically destroyed, their thin armor no protection against point-blank fire. Jimmy's LVT was among those that reached the beach, its hull punctured by multiple hits, its driver killed by a bullet through the viewport. "Out! Everyone out!" Sergeant Sullivan screamed, and Jimmy found himself splashing through shallow water toward the seawall, bullets cracking past his head, explosions throwing up geysers of water and coral. He made it to cover and pressed himself against the log wall, gasping for breath, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Around him, Marines huddled in similar positions, some wounded, others simply frozen by the intensity of fire. Bodies floated in the water behind them, men who'd made it off the reef but not to the beach. Their stories ended in chest-deep water, hundreds of yards from their objective. The scope of the disaster became apparent quickly. They were pinned down, unable to advance, taking casualties every minute they remained exposed, with follow-on waves stranded on the reef, unable to provide reinforcement. Colonel David Shoup, the assault commander, had been wounded coming ashore but refused evacuation. He established a command post just inland from the beach and began organizing the chaos into something resembling a coordinated assault. His leadership in those crucial early hours would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but in the moment he was simply a Marine officer doing his job, inspiring men through personal courage, making tactical decisions under fire, refusing to accept defeat despite circumstances that would have broken lesser leaders. "We need to get off this beach!" Sullivan rallied his surviving men. "Staying here means dying here. Engineers, blow that seawall. Everyone else, covering fire." "On my signal, we're going over and pushing inland," It was madness, but staying pinned was certain death, and Marines didn't surrender. They advanced into fire rather than away from it, even when every instinct screamed to take cover and hide. The engineers placed demolition charges and blew a gap in the seawall. The explosion was deafening, the concussion stunning men on both sides. In that moment of confusion, Sullivan led his Marines forward, into the teeth of Japanese defensive fire, determined to secure a foothold beyond the beach. Jimmy found himself running, firing his rifle at muzzle flashes, throwing grenades at bunker apertures, operating on instinct and training because conscious thought had become impossible. They made it perhaps 50 yards before Japanese fire forced them to ground. Men fell around Jimmy. Washington took a bullet through the leg and collapsed, screaming. Rodriguez was killed instantly by a burst of machine gun fire that nearly tore him in half. Parker lost an arm to shrapnel, but somehow kept firing his rifle one-handed until blood loss finally took him. The casualties were horrific, beyond anything even Guadalcanal veterans had experienced. Tommy Chen fought beside Jimmy, his rifle cracking with metronomic precision, each shot carefully aimed despite the chaos. When a Japanese soldier emerged from a concealed spider hole behind them, Tommy spun and put 3 rounds center mass before the enemy could fire. When ammunition ran low, he scavenged from fallen Marines, keeping his weapon in the fight. When Jimmy was momentarily pinned by machine gun fire, Tommy provided covering fire that allowed him to reach better cover. The first day of Tarawa was hell compressed into hours of sustained horror. Marines fought for every yard, clearing bunkers with flamethrowers and demolitions, advancing across open ground swept by fire, dying in numbers that shocked even experienced commanders. By nightfall, they'd secured only a small perimeter, a toehold purchased with extraordinary courage and terrible loss. Nearly a third of the assault force was killed or wounded on that first day. Jimmy spent that night in a shell crater with Tommy and 5 other Marines, listening to the sounds of Japanese counterattacks being beaten back, hearing the cries of wounded men who couldn't be reached in the darkness. His hands shook uncontrollably, not from fear now, but from delayed shock, from having survived what should have killed him, from watching friends die while he lived. Survivor's guilt joined the weight of trauma he already carried. "We're going to die here," one of the young Marines, a replacement who'd joined after Guadalcanal, said quietly. "We can't take this island. They're too well defended." "We'll take it," Tommy replied, his voice hard as stone. "We'll take it because we're Marines and that's what we do. We'll take it because our friends died giving us this foothold, and we won't let that sacrifice be meaningless. We'll take it because America needs us to, and we don't let America down." He looked at Jimmy, and in the darkness his eyes reflected the muzzle flashes of ongoing combat. "Right, Jimmy, we finish what we start." "Right," Jimmy agreed, finding strength in his friend's conviction. "We finish what we start." The second day of Tarawa brought renewed determination. Marines who'd survived the first day's slaughter understood the stakes. They either took this island or died trying, and dying without accomplishing the mission was unacceptable. Reinforcements managed to land as Navy engineers found channels through the reef, allowing landing craft to bring in tanks, artillery, and fresh troops. The balance slowly began to shift. Jimmy fought through that second day in a haze of exhaustion and rage. Rage at the Japanese for defending so fanatically. Rage at the planners who'd sent them into this meat grinder. Rage at himself for surviving when so many good men had died. But he channeled that rage into purpose, using it to fuel his movements as his squad cleared bunkers one by one, using flamethrowers to burn out defenders who refused to surrender, demolitions to collapse positions that resisted all other methods. The flamethrowers were horrific weapons but necessary. Japanese defenders in concrete bunkers could withstand direct hits from naval shells, could hold out against small arms fire indefinitely. But they couldn't withstand liquid fire. Jimmy watched as flamethrower teams approached bunker apertures, sending gouts of burning fuel inside, the screams of burning men audible even over the constant gunfire. It was hell creating hell, and there was no glory in it. Only the grim satisfaction of removing another enemy position, of advancing another 20 yards toward victory. Chen fought with mechanical efficiency, his face expressionless, his movements economical and deadly. He'd become what war made of good men, a killer, highly efficient, emotionally shut down to function despite the horror surrounding him. When a wounded Japanese soldier tried to detonate a grenade as Tommy approached, Tommy shot him before the pin could be pulled. When a sniper in a palm tree killed a Marine from their unit, Tommy located the position and put 3 rounds into the tree until the sniper's body fell like rotten fruit. There was no hesitation, no mercy, only the cold calculation of survival and mission accomplishment. By the afternoon of November 22nd, the 3rd day, the Japanese defensive perimeter had collapsed into isolated pockets of resistance. The Marines controlled most of Betio, including the airfield that had been the operation's objective. But the fighting continued with undiminished ferocity. Japanese soldiers, knowing they were defeated, launched suicidal counterattacks rather than surrender. Groups of them charged Marine positions with fixed bayonets, screaming their war cries, choosing death in combat over the dishonor of capture. One such attack hit Jimmy's position just after midnight on November 23rd. Approximately 50 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, charged across open ground toward Marine foxholes. Machine guns cut them down, but some reached the American positions and brutal hand-to-hand combat erupted. Jimmy found himself grappling with a Japanese officer who'd lost his rifle and fought with a sword and insane courage. They rolled in the coral sand, each trying to kill the other, until Tommy shot the officer at contact range, saving Jimmy's life for at least the 3rd time since Guadalcanal. "We're even," Tommy panted, helping Jimmy to his feet. "You saved me at Tenaru. I've saved you here. After this, we both owe each other so much we'll never be able to repay it. And we'll just have to survive the war and spend the rest of our lives trying," Jimmy replied, checking himself for wounds and finding none despite the closeness of the combat. Dawn of November 23rd brought the final phase of the battle. The remaining Japanese defenders, perhaps 200 men out of the original 4,500, were cornered in the eastern tail of the island. Rather than surrender, they launched one last banzai charge, a final desperate gesture of defiance. The Marines, weary beyond description, but determined to finish what they'd started, met the charge with overwhelming firepower. Within minutes, it was over. Betio was secure. The casualty count was staggering and would shock the American public when news reached home. Over 1,000 Marines and Navy corpsmen killed in just 76 hours of combat, more than 2,300 wounded. The 2nd Marine Division had suffered more casualties in 3 days at Tarawa than in 6 months on Guadalcanal. The Japanese had lost almost their entire garrison, only 17 prisoners taken from an original force of 4,500. The water surrounding Betio was so filled with bodies that Marines christened it Bloody Lagoon. Jimmy walked the beach on the morning after the fighting ended, surveying the devastation. Wrecked landing craft littered the reef. Bodies, American and Japanese, lay everywhere, already bloating in the tropical heat. The smell was indescribable, a combination of death, cordite, burning fuel, and human waste. This was what victory looked like when purchased at terrible cost, and Jimmy felt none of the triumph that should have accompanied success. Sergeant Sullivan gathered the survivors of their unit, less than half of those who'd landed 3 days earlier. Washington was being evacuated with his leg wound. Parker had died on the 2nd day, bleeding out from his arm amputation before corpsmen could reach him. Rodriguez was dead, killed in the first hours of the assault. A dozen other familiar faces were missing, some confirmed dead, others listed as missing and presumed dead. "We took the island," Sullivan said, his voice hoarse from 3 days of screaming orders over gunfire. "We accomplished our mission. The cost was higher than anyone expected, but we did what Marines do. We fought, we persevered, we won. Every one of you who's standing here earned the right to call yourself a veteran of Tarawa. That name will mean something. It already means something. You're part of Marine Corps legend now, whether you wanted to be or not." He paused, emotion breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "I know you're hurting. I know you've lost friends, seen things that will haunt you forever. I know some of you are questioning whether it was worth it. I can't answer that for you. All I can tell you is that this island, this airfield, will save American lives in the battles ahead. The lessons we learned here about amphibious assault, about proper bombardment, about reef landings, those lessons will be written in our blood, but they'll save thousands of lives in future operations. Your sacrifice mattered. Your friends' sacrifice mattered. Remember that when the nightmares come." Before you go, if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything as we continue to share these stories of courage and sacrifice. These men fought for freedom. Your engagement helps keep their memory alive. Jimmy spent the rest of that day helping with the grim task of recovering and identifying American dead. Each body represented a story cut short, potential unfulfilled, families that would receive telegrams beginning with the words every American household dreaded. "We regret to inform you." He found Marines he'd trained with, fought beside, shared meals and jokes and fears with. Each one was a fresh wound, adding to the accumulation of grief he carried. Tommy worked silently beside him, performing the task with the same mechanical efficiency he'd shown in combat. But that night, sitting in a captured Japanese bunker that still smelled of death, Tommy finally broke. He wept, not quietly, but with great, gasping sobs that shook his entire body. Jimmy held him, offering no words because there were no adequate words, just the presence of a brother who understood, because he felt the same grief, the same exhaustion, the same overwhelming burden of survival. "Why us?" Tommy asked when he'd regained some composure. "Why did we live when so many better men died?" Rodriguez had a wife and kids. Parker was going to be a teacher. Washington, his voice caught. "Washington is going to lose his leg, Jimmy. They're amputating. His life is forever changed. And for what? A piece of coral 2 miles long." "For freedom," Jimmy replied, repeating what they'd been told, what they'd told themselves. "For America, for the people back home who don't have to fight because we're doing it for them." The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, but they were all he had. We live because someone has to carry the memory of those who didn't. We live because the war isn't over, and they still need us. We live because our friends would want us to, would want their deaths to mean something. They sat in silence for a long time. 2 young men aged beyond their years by war, bound together by shared trauma and mutual survival. Outside, the Pacific night was beautiful. Stars brilliant in the unpolluted sky, waves gently lapping against the reef, a tropical breeze carrying away the worst of the day's heat. The contrast between nature's peace and humanity's violence seemed obscene. Letters arrived from home in early December, mail that had been following the unit for weeks. Jimmy received 3 from his mother, each one filled with news from Kansas, crops harvested, weather changes, gossip from church. He wrote about preparing for Christmas, about praying for his safety, about how proud his father would have been. She mentioned Sally Henderson visiting regularly, helping with farm work, reading Jimmy's letters aloud to his mother, whose eyes weren't what they used to be. Normal life continuing back home while Jimmy fought in hell half a world away. Sally's letters were different. She wrote about love, about waiting for him, about plans for their wedding when he came home. She'd saved money from her job at the general store, was already planning details, the dress she'd wear, the flowers she'd carry, the reception they'd have in the church hall. Her letters were acts of faith, declarations that despite everything, despite war and death and uncertainty, she believed in their future together. Jimmy read and reread those letters, drawing strength from her belief in tomorrow. The Marines were pulled off Tarawa in mid-December, sent back to Hawaii for rest and reconstitution. The 2nd Marine Division had been shattered by Tarawa, needed months to absorb replacements, train them, forge them into effective combat units. But the Pacific campaign wouldn't wait. Other islands needed to be taken, other battles fought. The war ground on with relentless momentum, consuming men and material, advancing inexorably toward Japan itself. On the transport ship heading to Hawaii, Jimmy stood at the rail, watching Tarawa recede into the distance. That tiny island, barely visible on maps, had consumed thousands of lives in just 3 days. But it had also proven something crucial, that even the most heavily fortified Japanese positions could be taken by American forces willing to pay the price. Every subsequent amphibious operation would benefit from lessons learned at Tarawa, written in the blood of Marines who'd waded through chest-deep water under fire, who'd cleared bunkers with flamethrowers and explosives, who'd refused to quit even when casualties mounted beyond anything previously experienced. "What do you think happens next?" Tommy asked, joining Jimmy at the rail. His wounds had healed, but he'd never lost the slight limp, the reminder of Guadalcanal carried in his stride. "More islands," Jimmy replied. "More fighting, more dying, until either we reach Japan or Japan surrenders. Could be years still." He turned to face his friend. "But we'll make it, Tommy. We've survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa, survived when better men didn't. That means something, even if we don't understand what yet. Maybe we're meant to tell the story, to make sure people remember what was sacrificed out here." "Maybe," Tommy agreed quietly. "Or maybe we're just lucky, and our luck will run out on the next island or the one after. But until it does, I'm glad we're together, Jimmy. Glad I've got at least one person who understands what it's been like, what we've seen and done." The ship's engines thrummed steadily, carrying them away from one battlefield toward rest before the next. Above them, the Pacific sky stretched endlessly, indifferent to human struggle, witness to both terrible violence and extraordinary courage. Somewhere back in that vast ocean lay 2 islands, Guadalcanal and Tarawa, where ordinary American men had become heroes, where the tide of war had turned, where the cost of freedom had been measured in blood and sacrifice. Jimmy Harrison, farm boy from Kansas, who'd answered his country's call, who'd fought at Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal and Tarawa, who'd lost friends and killed enemies and survived what should have killed him, stood at that rail and made a silent vow. If he survived this war, when he survived it, because he had to believe in survival, he would spend the rest of his life making sure people remembered the courage, the sacrifice, the terrible price paid by his generation so that future generations could live free. The men who died at Pearl Harbor, at Tenaroo River, at Edson's Ridge, at Tarawa, they deserved to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals who'd answered when called, who'd fought when afraid, who'd given everything for something larger than themselves. That was the story Jimmy would tell, the mission that would give meaning to his survival. Behind him, the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant reds and oranges, beautiful and indifferent. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new tests of courage. But tonight, Jimmy Harrison allowed himself to think of home, of wheat fields and church bells, of his mother's embrace and Sally's kiss, of the America he'd fought to protect and would fight to see again. He'd been transformed by war from a farm boy into a Marine, from an innocent into a veteran, From a boy into a man who'd seen the absolute worst humanity could inflict, and yet somehow maintained faith in humanity's essential goodness. That transformation, purchased at such terrible cost, was both burden and honor. A weight he'd carry forever, but a weight that gave his life purpose and meaning. The war would continue. More islands, more battles, more sacrifices lay ahead. But Jimmy Harrison and Tommy Chen, brothers forged in combat's crucible, would face them together. They'd survived hell twice over and emerged scarred but unbroken. Whatever came next, they'd endure it. Because they were Marines, because they were Americans, because they refused to let their fallen brothers' sacrifices be in vain. And someday, when the last shot was fired and peace finally came, they'd go home and build the future those fallen heroes had died to secure.